Ted Bundy, one of the most notorious serial killers in American history, managed to deceive police for years. Charming, educated, and seemingly normal, he committed heinous crimes that shocked the nation. He was a law student, handsome, articulate, and charismatic. Women found him attractive and trustworthy. Neighbors thought he was a pleasant young man with a bright future ahead of him. But beneath this carefully constructed facade lurked something terrifying. Bundy confessed to murdering over 30 young women, though investigators believe the actual number may be much higher. But what motivated his horrific acts? How did he become the person he was? What transforms a seemingly normal individual into one of history's most prolific killers? Today, we're going to try to understand how the mind of a serial killer works and what psychology can teach us about these criminals. This isn't about glorifying violence or sensationalizing tragedy. Instead, we'll explore the science, the psychology, and the human factors that create these individuals, hoping that understanding might help prevent future atrocities. Let's begin by examining Ted Bundy's methods more closely. During the 1970s, Bundy operated across multiple states, leaving a trail of victims from Washington to Florida. His approach was calculated and sophisticated. He would often wear a fake cast on his arm or leg, pretending to be injured and asking young women for help, carrying books or loading items into his vehicle. Other times, he impersonated police officers or authority figures, using fake badges to gain trust. Once his victims were vulnerable, he would attack them with sudden, brutal violence. What made this even more disturbing was not just the violence itself, but the level of planning involved. Bundy would scout locations, study his victims' routines, and create elaborate scenarios to lure them. He kept souvenirs from his victims and would sometimes return to the crime scenes to relive his crimes. This wasn't impulsive violence. This was methodical, organized, and deeply psychological. His appearance played a crucial role in his success as a predator. Bundy was handsome by conventional standards, well-spoken, and studied law at the University of Washington and later at the University of Utah. He worked at a suicide prevention hotline, where, ironically, he counseled people in crisis. He was involved in local politics and even received a commendation from the Seattle Police Department for chasing down a purse snatcher. He was, by all external measures, a model citizen. This is what made him so dangerous and so difficult to catch. People simply couldn't believe that this charming, educated man could be capable of such monstrous acts. Even during his trial, women would attend court sessions, some claiming to be in love with him. This cognitive dissonance, this inability to reconcile appearance with reality, is part of what makes serial killers so terrifying. Now consider John Wayne Gacy, another name that represents a different but equally chilling profile. Gacy was a respected member of his community in suburban Chicago during the 1960s and 70s. He was married twice, had children, and ran a successful construction business. He was active in the Democratic Party, even having his photograph taken with First Lady Rosalind Carter. He regularly performed as Pogo the Clown at children's hospitals, charity events, and birthday parties. He was a member of the JCs, a civic organization, and received awards for his community service. To everyone who knew him, John Wayne Gacy was a pillar of the community, perhaps a bit overbearing at times, but fundamentally a good man trying to make a positive difference. But beneath this carefully maintained public image, Gacy was responsible for the murders of at least 33 young men and boys between 1972 and 1978. He would lure victims to his house with promises of construction work or simply by using his affable personality to gain their trust. Once inside his house, he would trap them, torture them, and eventually murder them. Most horrifyingly, Gacy buried 26 of his victims in the crawl space beneath his house, while disposing of others in a nearby river. The smell of decomposition became so strong that Gacy told neighbors and visitors that it was a moisture problem in his crawl space or a backed-up sewage line. For years, bodies literally lay beneath his house while he hosted parties, entertained guests, and continued his community activities. Like Bundy, Gacy was a master of deception, hiding his dark side behind a mask of normalcy and respectability. In both cases, Bundy and Gacy seemed like ordinary people at first glance, perhaps even exemplary citizens. They had jobs, relationships, and social lives. They contributed to their communities and maintained the appearance of normalcy. They blended into society seamlessly, often excelling in social situations. But what goes on in the mind of someone capable of committing such atrocities? How can someone torture and murder while maintaining a completely normal-appearing life? This is where psychology becomes essential to understanding these individuals, and where we must dig deeper into the science of criminal behavior. Let's explore the psychological concepts that help explain the mentality of a serial killer. One of the most important terms you'll hear in this context is psychopathy. It's crucial to understand that psychopathy exists on a spectrum, and while not every psychopath is a criminal, many serial killers demonstrate classic psychopathic traits. These include a profound lack of empathy, superficial charm, a grandiose sense of self-worth, pathological lying, manipulation of others, lack of remorse or guilt, shallow emotional responses, and a failure to accept responsibility for their actions. Psychopaths can mimic emotions they don't actually feel, which allows them to navigate social situations and appear completely normal, even warm and caring. They learn to recognize what emotions are appropriate in different contexts and can perform them convincingly, even though they don't experience these feelings internally. Ted Bundy was a textbook example of this. He could turn on the charm when he needed to, making people trust him instantly, even while planning their deaths. In interviews after his capture, Bundy spoke about his crimes with detachment, as if discussing someone else's actions. He showed no genuine remorse, only regret at being caught. When he did express what seemed like emotion, investigators noted it appeared rehearsed and performative. He understood intellectually that he should show remorse, so he would manufacture it for the cameras, but those who studied him closely could see the emptiness behind his eyes. This ability to mimic normal human emotion while feeling nothing is one of the most unsettling aspects of psychopathy. Another critical diagnosis is antisocial personality disorder, often abbreviated as ASPD. Many serial killers meet the diagnostic criteria for this condition, which involves a persistent pattern of disregarding and violating the rights of others. People with antisocial personality disorder often show no remorse for their actions, lie frequently and easily, fail to conform to social norms regarding lawful behavior, display impulsivity and failure to plan ahead, show irritability and aggressiveness, demonstrate reckless disregard for the safety of self or others, show consistent irresponsibility in work or financial obligations, and exhibit a lack of remorse after hurting or mistreating others. They view laws and social rules as obstacles to be navigated rather than moral guidelines to be followed. Both Bundy and Gacy displayed these characteristics throughout their lives, even before their killing sprees began. Bundy had a history of petty theft and voyeurism dating back to his teenage years. Gacy had previous convictions for sexual assault before his murder spree began. These weren't sudden transformations from good citizens to monsters. The warning signs were there, visible in retrospect, though often dismissed or overlooked at the time. But psychology alone doesn't fully explain why someone becomes a serial killer. We also need to look at their personal development and early trauma, because the vast majority of psychopaths never become violent criminals. There must be additional factors that push someone from having antisocial traits to acting on violent impulses. Research has consistently shown that many serial killers experienced significant trauma during childhood, whether through physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional neglect, or severely dysfunctional family dynamics. These early experiences can profoundly shape a person's psychology, their worldview, and their relationship with other human beings. When this development is disrupted by trauma, the results can be devastating. Take Ted Bundy, for example. The story of his early life reads like a case study in identity confusion and family dysfunction. He grew up believing his mother was his sister and his grandparents were his parents. This wasn't simply a mix-up, but a deliberate deception designed to hide the circumstances of his birth. His mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, was unmarried when she became pregnant with him in 1946, which carried enormous social stigma at that time. To avoid scandal, his grandparents raised him as their son, and he called his mother by her first name, believing she was his older sister. When Bundy discovered the truth about his parentage as a teenager, it reportedly had a significant psychological impact on him. Some psychologists believe this revelation, combined with never knowing his biological father's true identity and having a complicated, distant relationship with his mother, contributed to his deep-seated anger towards women, which he later expressed through violence. Bundy himself spoke about feeling inadequate, of not fitting in with wealthier classmates, of feeling like he was wearing a mask even in normal social situations. He described an emptiness inside himself, a feeling that something fundamental. Some experts believe that Gacy's later crimes were, in part, an attempt to exert the control and power he never had as a child, and to express the rage he'd accumulated from years of abuse and humiliation. His victims were often young men, similar in age to what Gacy was when he suffered most at his father's hands. The torture and domination he inflicted on his victims may have been a twisted way of reclaiming power, of reversing the helplessness he felt as an abused child. Of course, this doesn't excuse his actions in any way, but it helps us understand the psychological mechanisms at work. It's critically important to understand that trauma alone doesn't create a serial killer. This cannot be emphasized enough. Millions of people experience childhood abuse, neglect, and dysfunction, and the vast majority never become violent criminals. They become teachers, parents, healthcare workers, artists, and productive members of society. Many abuse survivors dedicate their lives to helping others avoid similar trauma. So why do some people with traumatic backgrounds become violent while others don't? This is one of the central questions in criminal psychology. What we're looking at is the interaction between biological factors, environmental influences, and individual personality, what criminologists sometimes call the biopsychosocial model. Modern psychology views criminal behavior as the result of this complex interplay. Some individuals may have a genetic predisposition to certain personality traits, such as low empathy, impulsivity, or difficulty processing emotions. Brain imaging studies have shown that some violent criminals have differences in brain structure, particularly in areas responsible for emotional regulation and impulse control. When these biological predispositions are combined with environmental factors like abuse, neglect, or exposure to violence, and when an individual lacks protective factors like stable relationships, positive role models, or intervention at critical moments, the risk of violent behavior increases significantly. Think of it like a combination lock. You need multiple numbers in the right sequence to open the lock. A person might have genetic predispositions, experience childhood trauma, lack positive attachments, develop antisocial personality traits, and still never commit violence. But add another factor, perhaps substance abuse, a specific triggering event, or escalating antisocial behavior without intervention, and suddenly that lock opens and violence becomes possible. This is why prevention is so challenging. We're not looking for a single cause, but a constellation of risk factors. Now let's talk about how someone progresses from being a troubled individual to becoming a serial killer, because this transformation doesn't happen overnight. Most serial killers don't start with murder. Instead, they begin with smaller offenses and gradually escalate their behavior over time. This process is often referred to as the escalation of violence, and it's remarkably consistent across different serial killers. A person might start with petty theft, fire setting, or cruelty to animals in childhood, behaviors that psychologists recognize as warning signs. They might then progress to voyeurism, burglary, or assault in adolescence and young adulthood. Eventually, unchecked, this behavior escalates to serious violence and murder. Ted Bundy's history shows this pattern clearly. As a teenager and young adult, he engaged in petty theft, shoplifting items he didn't need. He would peer through windows at night, watching women undress, which is voyeuristic behavior. He stole items from women's apartments, taking underwear and other personal items. These behaviors gradually became more invasive and more connected to his sexual fantasies. It wasn't a sudden jump from being a normal person to being a killer. It was a gradual progression, each step bringing him closer to violence, each successful crime emboldening him to go further. This escalation happens partly because the criminal begins to normalize their behavior in their own mind. Each time they commit a crime and get away with it, the behavior becomes more acceptable to them. The psychological barriers that prevent most people from hurting others, our empathy, our sense of right and wrong, our fear of consequences, gradually erode. What once seemed unthinkable becomes routine. The first time Bundy stole something, he probably felt nervous, his heart racing, worried about getting caught. But after doing it successfully many times, it became easy, almost boring. He needed to escalate to get the same thrill, the same sense of power and control.
Serial killers also engage in a process called rationalization. They create justifications for their actions that allow them to continue without feeling guilt or remorse. These rationalizations can take many forms. Some killers convince themselves that their victims deserved what happened to them, or that they were somehow helping their victims by putting them out of their misery. Others claim they couldn't control themselves, that they were compelled by forces beyond their understanding. Some, like Bundy, initially denied their crimes entirely, creating elaborate alternative explanations. Later, when denial was no longer possible, Bundy blamed pornography for his actions, claiming it corrupted him. These rationalizations serve to protect the killer's self-image and allow them to continue their behavior. Many serial killers dehumanize their victims, seeing them not as real people with lives, families, and dreams, but as objects to be used and discarded. This psychological distancing makes it easier for them to commit horrific acts without breaking down emotionally. They don't see their victims as someone's daughter, someone's brother, or someone's friend. They see them as things, as means to fulfill their own twisted desires, as props in their personal fantasy. Bundy referred to his victims as cargo and possessions. Gacy said that his victims were worthless and that killing them was no different than taking out the trash. This dehumanization is a crucial psychological mechanism that allows serial killers to function. This lack of empathy is perhaps the most chilling aspect of the serial killer's psychology. Most of us feel uncomfortable even imagining causing harm to another person. If we accidentally hurt someone, even mildly, we feel immediate remorse and the urge to apologize and make amends. Our mirror neurons fire when we see others in pain, causing us to literally feel a shadow of their suffering. But for someone like Bundy or Gacy, this emotional connection simply didn't exist or was so weak as to be meaningless. They could look into the eyes of another human being, see their terror and pain, hear them plead for their lives, and feel nothing. In some cases, the victim's fear and suffering actually increased the killer's pleasure. This emotional dissociation, this complete absence of empathy, is what allowed them to commit act after act of violence without breaking down, without the emotional toll that would cripple a normally functioning person. But we cannot and must not focus solely on the criminals. That would be to give them exactly what many of them wanted: attention, notoriety, and a place in history. For every murder committed, there is a devastating impact on families and communities that extends far beyond the immediate tragedy. The victims of these crimes had lives, dreams, and loved ones. They were daughters excited about college, sons building their careers, young people with their whole futures ahead of them. When those lives are taken, the ripples extend outward like waves from a stone thrown into water, touching everyone in widening circles. Families are left with unanswered questions, with grief that never fully heals. They wonder what their last moments were like, whether they suffered, whether they were afraid. They blame themselves, thinking of all the ways they might have prevented the tragedy. If only they'd insisted their daughter not go out that night. If only they'd picked up their son instead of letting him walk home. These what-ifs haunt them for the rest of their lives. Communities lose their sense of safety and trust. When someone like Gacy is arrested and bodies are discovered in his home, neighbors realized they'd been living next to a killer for years. They'd waved to him, chatted with him at neighborhood events, let their children attend parties where he performed as a clown. The violation of trust is profound and lasting. The effects can extend for generations as trauma is passed down through families. Children who lose a parent to murder grow up without that crucial relationship. Siblings of victims struggle with survivor's guilt, wondering why their brother or sister was taken while they were spared. Parents who lose children often say that a part of them dies too, that they can never be whole again. The emotional impact of such loss is immeasurable and enduring. Consider the families who never got closure, who spent years not knowing what happened to their loved ones. For many families of Bundy's victims, there were years of agonizing uncertainty. Was she still alive somewhere? Had she run away? Was she being held captive? When Bundy was finally caught and began confessing, some families finally got answers, but those answers brought their own terrible pain. Other families never got definitive answers at all because Bundy refused to reveal all his victims' locations or identities. He used this information as a bargaining chip, trying to delay his execution by promising to provide more details. Even in his final days, he was manipulating and controlling, showing no genuine remorse for the devastation he had caused. Think about the mothers, fathers, siblings, and friends who had to live with the knowledge that someone they cared about suffered at the hands of these killers. Many family members of victims struggle with post-traumatic stress disorder, experiencing flashbacks, nightmares, and severe anxiety. They develop depression that can last for decades. They struggle with survivor's guilt, feeling that they should have done something to prevent the tragedy, even when there was nothing they could have done. Some families break apart under the strain, marriages ending, siblings becoming estranged, the shared grief too painful to bear together. Others become closer, supporting each other through their shared trauma, but forever changed by their loss. These cases also force us to engage in deeper moral and social reflection. They make us ask difficult, uncomfortable questions about evil, human psychology, and our society as a whole. To what extent is society responsible for creating these individuals? If Bundy had received mental health intervention as a teenager when he was exhibiting warning signs, could his trajectory have been changed? If someone had believed Gacy when he reported his father's abuse, if he'd received proper treatment for his head injury and the psychological damage from his childhood, would those 33 young men still be alive? Could better intervention in childhood have prevented these tragedies? How can our understanding of psychology help us identify and help troubled individuals before they become violent criminals? We know the warning signs now. We know that the combination of certain childhood behaviors, cruelty to animals, fire setting, persistent bedwetting beyond normal age, social isolation, fascination with violence, can indicate serious psychological problems. We know that children who experience severe abuse need intervention. But knowing these things and actually implementing effective prevention are two different challenges.
These are not easy questions, and there are no simple answers. Our mental health system is often overwhelmed and underfunded. Warning signs are sometimes missed or dismissed. Privacy laws and parental rights can make intervention difficult. Sometimes people who need help don't want it or don't recognize they need it. Sometimes intervention happens but isn't effective. Sometimes people seem to improve and then relapse into destructive behavior. The challenge of prevention is enormous and complicated, but they are questions worth asking and efforts worth making. Understanding the psychology of serial killers isn't about excusing their behavior or diminishing their responsibility. Bundy, Gacy, and others like them made choices. They chose to act on their impulses rather than seeking help. They chose to continue killing even when they'd had opportunities to stop. They are responsible for their actions, and understanding their psychology doesn't change that fundamental moral truth. Rather, understanding is about learning how to potentially prevent such tragedies in the future. If we can identify the warning signs early, if we can provide better mental health support to those who need it, if we can intervene in cases of child abuse more effectively, if we can create a society that takes mental health as seriously as physical health, perhaps we can save lives. Perhaps we can identify troubled individuals before they become violent. Perhaps we can provide the support and treatment that redirect someone away from violence and toward healing. As we conclude, let's recap what we've learned today. While it's impossible to fully comprehend what goes on in the mind of a serial killer, and perhaps that's for the best, as complete understanding might require thinking like they do, understanding the psychology behind their acts can help us prevent more lives from being destroyed. We've seen how factors like psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder create individuals who lack empathy and remorse, who can manipulate others while feeling nothing themselves. We've explored how childhood trauma, while not an excuse and not sufficient on its own to create a killer, can combine with other factors to increase the risk of violent behavior. We've discussed the gradual escalation of violence, how serial killers typically start with smaller crimes and work their way up to murder, normalizing their behavior along the way. We've examined the psychological mechanisms of rationalization and dehumanization that allow these individuals to commit terrible acts without breaking down. We've also recognized that the impact of their crimes extends far beyond the immediate victims, affecting families, communities, and society as a whole, creating ripples of trauma that can last for generations. The study of criminal psychology isn't just academic. It's not about satisfying morbid curiosity or sensationalizing violence. It has real-world applications in preventing violence and supporting those who have been affected by it. Criminal profilers use this knowledge to help catch active killers, potentially saving lives. Mental health professionals use it to identify individuals at risk and provide intervention. Policymakers use it to design better systems for addressing child abuse and supporting mental health. Victims' families use it to try to make sense of senseless tragedies and to advocate for change. Each of us has a role to play as well. Be more attentive to the signs of suffering around you. Pay attention to the mental health of those in your life, especially young people who may be struggling. If a child in your community is being abused, report it. If a teenager is exhibiting concerning behavior, don't dismiss it as just a phase. If someone you know is struggling with violent thoughts or urges, encourage them to seek professional help. Understanding others and offering support when needed can make a genuine difference. While we can't prevent all violence, human behavior is too complex and we don't have perfect knowledge or unlimited resources. We can create a society that's more aware, more compassionate, and better equipped to help those in need before tragedy strikes. We can fund mental health services adequately. We can train teachers and pediatricians to recognize warning signs. We can support families dealing with trauma. We can reduce the stigma around seeking mental health treatment. We can create systems that balance individual rights with community safety. The comprehension of human behavior in all its complexity remains one of our most powerful tools in building a safer, more humane world. Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy are dead, executed for their crimes, but the lessons their cases teach us live on. The question is whether we'll learn those lessons, whether we'll use that knowledge to prevent the next Bundy, the next Gacy, the next serial killer who blends into society while planning horrors. The answer to that question lies not just with law enforcement or mental health professionals, but with all of us, with our willingness to pay attention, to care, to intervene when we see someone struggling, and to build a society that values prevention as much as punishment. Thank you for watching this difficult but important exploration of criminal psychology. Remember, understanding evil doesn't mean accepting it. It means equipping ourselves to fight it more effectively.